Is that coming through? Thumbs up for you can see the screen just now. Great. So I'm going to be speaking to you all about designing for urban spaces. And although it sounds like a couple of you have some more, well, many of you will have, not all of you have more experience than I do, as I actually only got my permaculture design certificate in about April of this year. Figured that lockdown in London was as good a time as any to finally do it. But I've been gardening for about 3 years. And so since in the last 6 months, really, though, is when I've gotten engaged in all the projects I'm going to tell you about in the rest of this talk. And along the way, there are some considerations, particularly for urban permaculture, that I've highlighted along the way, things that I think make it a bit unique to designing for a more suburban or rural setting. So hopefully that's interesting, and just, you know, I always find it inspiring to see new spaces, and there's a lot of sites, you know, about 7 different gardens in which I'm involved, although 6 of them are community centers. One is just the design that is on my roof out the window behind the back of me. So if I'm running over, we may not get to that one, but focus on the community projects, and that are all within a 20-minute cycle of my flat. So we'll start off just showing you the route that I take to the gardens. I don't think I've ever visited them all in one day, but starting off home here in Angel, the first stop on our path is up to Tunnel Garden. So this is a view down the canal from my plot in Tunnel Garden. It's a community garden that's semi-private. There's a set of allotments, and it's a fairly informal collection of neighbors who like to share gardening tips and also celebrate the summer and winter solstices together with a bonfire. And so one of the things that we have to consider at Tunnel Garden is planting directly into the soil. And by that, I mean that because the garden is located over the actual tunnel through which the canal runs, that connects from the Angel side through toward Hackney, we can't actually put trees directly into the ground, and we have to line all of our beds so they can't extend directly into the rest of the soil that's there. So you can see in the middle, this is a cherry tree that we rescued from a neighbor who was clearing out their own garden, and try to use a lot of recycled materials. So this is just an old trash can that I drilled some holes into the bottom of, so it's got a little bit of drainage. And we, because all of the trees in the garden actually have to be in containers so that their root systems don't damage the structural integrity of the tunnel that they sit above. So that's one kind of unique consideration of Tunnel Garden. It's a very long, skinny garden. It's also quite like publicly visible. And so another thing that we have to think about is securing some of our items. So as you can see, there's a very popular path on the upper right-hand corner, and the garden is located just off to the left. We use a padlock to secure it, so that people with the code or neighbors have access to the garden, since there are private allotments. And I guess there's been experiences in the past where people have, you know, taken other people's food or goods that we grow. And so there are still people who, you know, you can hop over the fence, I guess, to access the garden. But we've got quite a, the picture on the image on the left is the back corner of the garden. That's got, I don't think you probably, if anybody could spy where we keep key, that's the key to the tool shed, which is just here, this big dark gray box, and then the water main, which is located inside this box. In addition to rainwater catchment, we do have access to a hose, but we've hidden a key. So if any of you visit the garden, you'll now know the secret. That's in like a birdhouse back in the corner, so that it's there for everybody who wants to use it. We don't have to, you know, there's no one holder of the key, and everyone who's a part of the garden can access it, but it's relatively hidden from people who might just enter the garden and not be not be people who have plots there. So considerations of tunnel garden. Our next garden on the stop is a bike about maybe 10 more minutes away to, or not even as far as that, to Alara. And Alara is in the oasis, or is what I consider an oasis in the heart of King's Cross. Alex Smith started Alara Garden around the factory where he owns a muesli company in 2005. And it's an extremely dense part of the city, very industrial. And so it's really incredible what he's been able to do with the garden. There are 80 different food crops, including the largest yacon plantation, which I tasted for the first time this year in Europe. And I've actually got a clip from a film that was made. It's about 4 minutes, and it featured Alara at the London Open Gardens Trust. So the video is a tiny bit laggy, but the sound comes through okay, and I'm just going to play this clip for you now so you can get an inside view of Alara.
Up, we meet Alex Smith, who launched his business from a squat with £2 notes he found on the street. Roll forward 40 years, and his was the very first cereal company in the world to be certified organic. Today, we discover more about the factory's permaculture garden.
This permaculture forest garden is situated in King's Cross, so it's in central London. What these gardens do, I think, is bring the value of food back into the middle of the city. So this is the entrance to our garden. It's made with coppice sweet chestnut, and it's just by the entrance to our factory here. These went in the ground 20 years ago, and they don't rot, so they're there permanently. We cleaned out 50 tons of rubbish across this garden, some of it rather insalubrious. And we're right by here, giving heat to our garden, the largest concrete works in the middle of London. And here, including these 2 Roman stones, and one I like to think is pre-Roman. So when I sit here in what I like to think of my stone throne, I imagine myself connected with the past. The thing about permaculture is it's the most biodiverse system of food growing, and you get the maximum amount of food off a piece of land. The key to our gardens here is Elaeagnus as the nitrogen fixing basis. So one of the genus is in flower now. It smells absolutely beautiful like jasmine, right up to other Elaeagnus genus now that are already in fruit. They're really, really rich in lycopene.
I love that this garden has so much variety and diversity growing in it in such a small place. Here we've got some little strawberries, and it's one of about 80 food crops that we have at the garden. And so as someone who practices permaculture, it's really exciting to have so many species all in one place.
In the gardens here, we've got quite a few rare apple trees. One of them is this Trinity. It's a beautiful red flesh apple and a cooker. This is our Alara vineyard. We've got about 30 vines here. It's a rondo variety, which is really suitable for growing in central London here. And I can see the flowers are starting to set. Looks like we're in for a vintage year this year. We don't sell this wine, but it's great for our parties. Cheers. These gardens help people understand the work involved in gardens, the work involved in food, and the amazing miracle that food is for people.
Inspirational gardener is Alex, creating an infrastructure for sustainable ways of living, growing, and organic eating, or permaculture for short, has never looked and sounded more delicious and fun.
So I'll bring it back just there.
Up, we meet Alex Smith.
There we go. Back to presentation. Okay, excellent. So this was just filmed in about, I think it was May of this year. And so it was still a bit grey and cold in London just then. So the garden's really come into bloom since, and this canopy is also covered in grapevines, and it's much more green these days. You can see the film crew in the background just shooting that film. This is Lisa, one of my colleagues actually, who's gotten involved in the garden as well. We volunteer together on Sundays. This is when we were sowing some seeds in the sort of nursery makeshift greenhouse, also made from all recycled materials, these clear flaps that kind of let some light in and retain heat quite well for them. And we're not up to bottling wine yet, but we have been able to bottle some of our elderflower champagne. So this is some of the other, myself and some of the other volunteers who also come down to the garden on Sundays and help with, whatever tasks really are on hand. So one of the considerations here around urban permaculture is how you actually organize volunteers. And the way that it's done at Alara is that there's sort of a standing invitation and understanding to anyone who wants to get involved that will be there from around 10 o'clock to 12 or 1 o'clock on every Sunday morning, which is, and so occasionally we'll decide to have kind of a group meal, share a meal afterward, or, go do something else in the afternoon. It's been a really great way to kind of start to wind down the weekend. The next garden is near Cat and Mouse Library. It doesn't actually have a formal site. It's it's what I would call a guerrilla garden that I got involved with through Extinction Rebellion. And really, it's just a neglected piece of roadside that extends from the Cat and Mouse Library to a bus stop. And it's neglected at the moment because there's a housing development that own the land up to the sidewalk, but mainly behind this grey wall, and have kind of just left this strip in between while they make plans for the development that they're going to be putting on the site. And so it was just kind of a long, lonely grey wall that's got, caution signs along it, and makes for not a very nice walkway down to the bus stop. And so one consideration here is would your council support you? Because what we've actually done is asked the council had a series of grants that were available and actually gave us £350 to put toward our guerrilla garden, which is great. And so this is an apple tree that we installed in the site. And something else you'll notice is that we've done a mix of using raised beds, also made from recycled coffee sacks and pallets, and mixed that with also putting some plants directly in the ground. Part of the rationale for this is that we know that we won't have this site may not exist forever, and because if the developers want us to move any of the things that we've added to the site, we'll need to respect that. But in the hope that some of the things might persist, we've left some things in the ground and designed some more natural beds, outlined with sticks and things that you can see here, and using some newspaper and cardboard to keep the weeds at bay, since we're not at this site every day. And it has actually come to pass. You'll notice the coffee sack raised bed in another one of my photos later on, because we have actually had to move the raised beds from this site because the developers have said that they wanted to bring in their own planters and beautify the site themselves, which is great, because it means there will still be plants and it'll still be a more enjoyable place for the community to be. One thing that's been really nice about working on this site is that the there are always passersby who comment about how much nicer it is now. There was one man who told me that he never really paid much attention to the site until he started smelling onions when he would walk by, and we had planted some garlic and onions. And so it was neat that he was noticing that, and really excited that there were edible food there. The other consideration, though, that you have to think about when planting in urban sites is whether the harvest is actually safe to eat. So while we did put a few food crops in the ground, we have advised the community that they may not be safe to just pull up out of the ground and eat, because it is on quite a busy roadside. There's the possibility that air pollution is damaged or would make some of this food not the safest to eat. And so we've actually transitioned from planting more annual vegetable type things there to perennial flowers and things that visually will brighten the space, or like the tree would be up off the ground a bit, but things that are right on the ground have to consider that pollution might make them unsuitable for human consumption. From the library, we travel up to Chetwynd Road, which is where there is a garden that we now call Coconut Grove. In this picture, you might be able to spy up in the top right-hand corner why we call it Coconut Grove, somewhat of an ironic name for a site in London. But when we arrived, there was an old coconut that's now on top of the insect hotel that was on the site, and so became our sort of Wilson and mascot for this community site, which is really just a yard that is between two blocks of flats in Tufnell Park that hasn't ever been developed, and for which we know they've applied for planning permission for starting in the 1960s at least 3 or 4 times, but have never gotten it. And I think the hypothesis amongst the neighborhood is that they previously wanted this site to look as derelict and abandoned as possible, so that putting flats in would be, in a way, beautifying and making the area more safe. What we've done instead is turn it into a community garden that is inviting and accessible, but also somewhat protected. And so this is just a garden that we started to work on as more of a neighborhood in mid-May, and over the course of 2 months, it's really come a long way. So this was the first meeting we had with one of the neighborhood members who started working on the site, but had done a really good job acquiring a couple of containers for water catchment and some recycled tools from an abandoned tool site nearby, had built these raised beds and gotten some soil donated, had also found an old sink that he stuck in the ground to make a little bit a pond. And then from old pallets and wood that was on a site that he sawed and then drilled holes into to make an insect hotel, created this really impressive bug hotel on the right here. And so what we then, so then he exhausted himself a little bit by that time. And when it came to planting season, I think realized that it was too much to do by himself. And so started to bring some other people into the fold. So this consideration is then, once more people are part of your project, how do you actually make decisions together? So in this case, when we were deciding what we would do, there were some designing that I did. So, I drew up a couple of different designs as a way to give people some options to point out elements that they liked, or in this case, if we kept things roughly where they were, what would the design, could a design look like? Or if we decided to move some things in the site about so that they might be in a more ideal location, which also might be more work, but what then might a design look like? And from there, it was also not just being rigid and sticking with the design that we'd created, but having a conversation about design principles as well. Because then it makes it easy to make decisions like, okay, we've actually got some raised beds that needed to be moved from the library guerrilla garden site, and we hadn't originally incorporated that many raised beds into this design. But so this is where you'll I spy the raised bed wrapped in the coffee sack that you saw at the other site, which we ended up bringing here. And I think now there are actually even one or two more from that site that we've brought over. So the principle was that we wanted to use as many natural and recyclable materials as possible, and work toward the design, but do it in a way that wouldn't create, extra work, and would focus on spending time together and growing rather than getting everything perfect. So with that set of principles, we scheduled that we would come together as a community on the last Tuesday of every month, and we established a WhatsApp group. So that whenever people were going up to the garden, they could share with the other people in the neighborhood when they were going to be there, and if anyone wanted to join, they could come down. So you can see that just in 2 short months, it's got a lot more greenery. And we've also started to, because we wanted this to be a social space as well, started to collect some abandoned chairs, even an old barbecue. And there is the question of how we then share the spoils, especially if we're not all there at the same time. And if we don't have enough beds for every individual in the neighborhood to have their own bed, what do you do? And so some of the ways that we've dealt with this is a method called square foot gardening. So we had an agreement that for things that were, perennial in nature, like herbs that were going to, be quite productive, we wouldn't want everyone to plant their own and not use anyone else's. And then for things that were annual, we would use some string and sticks to roughly kind of divide up some of these larger boxes into patches. I don't have a close-up of this, unfortunately, but into 1 and 2 square foot kind of patches, a bit of a grid, so that people could have some defined different growing space. But more than that, we also, on those Tuesdays that we plant things together, we'll also try to harvest together. Or when you know that a lot of something has been planted at once in an area because you all were there kind of on a Tuesday, then going periodically throughout the month to retain some of that harvest is and just kind of like letting people know on the WhatsApp when you're going to be there has been a really fluid way of contributing to and benefiting from the harvest in the garden. This was a close-up of our radishes, which I should have actually gotten my hand in this shot because you can't tell, but they're literally from like palm to the tip of my finger, the largest radishes that I'd ever seen that grew in these beds. So I think we each only took like 2 home. This is the approach to the garden. And I mentioned that we have a WhatsApp group, and as people come down the street, they approach the garden, and especially earlier on the first couple of weeks that we had it, we had started doing things there. People were really curious. I think people are getting more used to us being there now, but this is kind of as you walk up to the garden, what it looks like, and then you realize what's going on behind that, behind the fence. And so we've had loads of people stop by and ask us what we're doing, and being just, and the biggest comment that anyone has when they're walking by is what they can bring, and what can they donate to the space. And so we've had donations of plants, of seeds, of tools. There was a woman the other day who stopped me while I was there to ask if she could bring us some pond forming substance so that we could either extend or make another pond. And so any one of those people who stops by to offer things, we also invite to be added to the WhatsApp group if they want to, so that they can feel more part of the garden. From Chetwynd and the Coconut Grove onto Story Garden, which is back in the heart of King's Cross, and actually a funded garden by Global Generation. Although it's got a mix of allotments, and they do run a lot of learning events. It's a very diverse community who are involved. And the main consideration here is, do things need to be movable? Because this is actually a temporary site. And one that doesn't have any existing, or it didn't when it started, any existing natural vegetation or soil. So quite a, that's the British Library that you see in the background. It's also sandwiched in between that and the Francis Crick Institute. And so they brought in just truckloads of wood chip, which in London is actually a free and abundant resource because there are so many tree surgeons that you can easily get truckloads of wood chip. And so they brought wood chip in and laid that down over the whole place to start to create their basis for some of the soil, but also obviously have lots of raised beds. And they've been here on this site for 2 years now, and I believe they have 1 more year until they have to move to their what will be a permanent location, which is great. But they've accomplished and built so much, and so even the larger buildings, like the yurt and the container, are totally movable items that will have to be evacuated, basically, at the end of the next year. The Story Garden provides a lot of really great examples of how to just different techniques and ways to use different technologies and recycled materials. So there's a skip garden that's just a series of old abandoned skips that they've made into irrigated raised beds. There's air pots that they have linked up with drip irrigation that encourage root growth outward toward the edges so that the trees that they have to have in containers don't get too pot bound. I just love this little, it's a kid's story time, like a storytelling circle that they've made out of willow branches and planted flowers in the base of. And then this hugel mound, again, because they didn't have soil, I think they brought in just a giant log. And then kind of using natural succession almost, I think they chucked a couple of bags of compost over it in the first year, and then broadcast some seed that they knew would do well with minimal soil. And from there, just let it establish itself. That's been great. This is just a quick clip of a community event. This was the 2-year anniversary of the garden, and one of the youth volunteers there who wrote a song about climate change and performed it that I just thought was incredibly beautiful. So I'll just play very quickly this clip. Yeah, so it's just lovely. There we go. So that's Story Garden. The last garden on the stop will be Stepney City Farm. And this is a 3-acre working farm, and now also an educational charity. And they've been in the Tower Hamlets neighborhood for 40 years, actually. It started in 1979 after World War II. It had just been a site that was bombed out in the war and derelict. And this is a really great example of how the local residents worked together to secure and maintain a bigger space that continues to grow. So this is an aerial shot of Stepney City Farm. And while it has grown and shrunk in size over the years and is growing again now, it's a really great example of designing. These are mandala beds in the bottom left corner here. There's allotments in the middle. It's also one of the only site. It is the only site that I'm involved with. There are actually also animals in the space. So you can see animals, are not something that I thought I might get to interact with in city sites, but we can actually feed the slugs and snails that we hunt to the ducks that they have. And there are goats, bunnies, a couple of giant hogs, and there's a lot of compost that then comes from that. So it's a site where uniquely in such a dense city, you can actually still have the produce no waste and do things in a circular way that is more difficult to do when having animals in less space, but is totally possible on just a couple of acres. I think this was just literally a video of some of the goats there munching.
Hey guys. Oh, you want that one? Hey guys.
And I will end there. There's a couple more slides that if anyone's interested. There's just some home designing, but because those are all our community sites, and I realize I've already gone over 20 minutes, so I'll stop there.
You're absolutely fine, Molly. Do you want to just do a couple of minutes and talk about your garden design at home?
Sure. So I've used these principles that I've seen in the different sites that I've been involved with to take a stab at continuing to sort of develop the deck. That it's a rooftop space just outside my flat. This is what it looked like from the street last year. We got a couple of our sunflowers in bloom. And it's not a community space, but just our personal space where we do like to host friends. And it's been my really my come into its own as my lockdown project. So when we moved in year one, I built this single raised bed. And we got a couple of chairs from Argos. There was an existing picnic table, and that was about it. You can see that bed and the picnic table, and the first green things that I ever grew up there starting to grow. But what I realized is that to make that space any nicer, I was going to have to use recycled goods, basically, because that single raised bed, buying all the materials fresh, 3 years ago, cost me £100 at the end of the day. So I became a pallet collector. And that is something that in all of the sites that I've been involved with has been there's so many things in a city that get abandoned, even just on the side of the street, that finding ways to reuse all of them in gardens has been a fun challenge. So year two, collected enough pallets to create a couple more raised beds, a pallet bench, a few tables, and this is what the site then looked like as it was evolving. And then in season, but you'll notice that the rug here is an outdoor rug that we loved, but one thing that we didn't quite realize was how windy it gets on our roof. So another thing about urban spaces is that because of the airflow between buildings, it can cause gusts that are like strong and actually lift some of our things off the roof. So we lost that rug in the first year, and you'll notice that in the photos of this next year, where I've added a couple of dwarf fruit forests, emphasis on the dwarf, and a couple more potted things, and experimenting with a couple of other types of raised beds, and even getting some composting set up on my roof, is that this rug is a different one. And that's because we had a super strong gust of wind one day that literally, even with the trees and the benches on top of the benches that we used to have on top of the rug, it actually blew off the roof, and I think got rolled up and carried away at the end of the day. So someone else is hopefully enjoying that rug now, but it meant that we had to get a different one. And because that could have been quite a dangerous event, we have taken extra precaution to make sure that we secure everything that goes on the roof, to make sure that it's safe for our neighbors. My partner is Scottish. You can probably tell from my accent that I'm not from the States, but this was I took this picture during the Euros. And so you can see the amount of diversity in food that we've managed to integrate into the space now that it's my third year growing here. So that is what I've managed to do. And then this is, my hopes for the space would be to add a bit more raised bed space, maybe some more composting capacity, and a type of pergola would be nice because it gets quite sunny, and so having a bit of shade for the seating area would be lovely. What I've done is condense all of the topics that I've kind of touched on over the course of the presentation into a sort of urban permaculture checklist for anyone thinking about designing a new space in an urban setting, some of the questions to ask yourself as you are setting that space up. And as we move into questions, because I'm a relatively new permaculturist, having just gotten my certificate at the beginning of this year, I would love to hear from you all. In addition to any questions that you have, what stands out as the most unique features of urban permaculture that's different in what you've seen from designing for spaces that you may have in more suburban or rural settings, and what you think the role of urban permaculture should be. Thank you so much. Oh, you're muted, Kath.
There I am again, saying something really inspirational when you can't hear me. Thanks, Molly. That was an absolutely brilliant talk. So I'd just like to open the floor up to everybody. If you've got any questions for Molly, now's your time. And can you take yourself off screen sharing as well, Molly, so we can have a gallery view again? Wonderful. Would anybody like to start? Go for it, Gary.
Unmute, stop typing. That was great, Molly. Actually, I actually saw some gardens there that I used to have to go to meetings in London and around Pentonville. So I saw some gardens that I used to walk past and wonder, I wonder who's doing this. Because in the weekdays, you know, there was nobody on site and you could see tons of stuff growing. It was fantastic. And that was a few years ago now, so it's brilliant. My comment, the role of urban permaculture as somebody who's been doing that for a long time, 15 years, is that I think the role for us in urban environments, you know, the most useful resources is people. That's a huge resource, and just the amount of rubbish that people throw away that you've been collecting. And I've got a thermal greenhouse built out of literally what came out of people's skips, apart from things like having to buy some cement and nails and screws and that sort of thing. So I think we have a role in helping communities transition from where we currently are into a more permaculture. Because of course, you know, I can't be dependent upon skip diving for the rest of my life, because once people start getting the message, they'll see those things that they're currently chucking away as an actual resource. So I think urban environments are, you know, it's the transitioning from where we currently are in the right direction to where we want to get to. That would be my comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any more questions from anybody? I mean, I've got a question, Molly. I'm amazed at how many things you're involved with. I just wondered how you found out about all of these projects.
Great question. So the Alara was the first project that I got involved with, and it was actually through the Permaculture Association website. So Kath, I know you mentioned that you're going to be doing an effort to sort of revamp that map. But when I went to, because my course was online, because it was during the kind of height of our third lockdown earlier this year, I decided that I wanted to do it anyway, but I also wanted to make sure that I could find some sites near me where I could get that hands-on experience. And so in going to the Permaculture Association website, Stepney and Alara were the two that showed up. And so I just went to their websites and sent them emails and got in touch with them to see what they were doing. And then they, you know, let me know when their regular kind of volunteering was and when I could come down. So that was the two initial ones. And since then have been, I guess it's kind of the thing that once you start getting involved in a space or a type of community in a city, there will be people that are involved in that space that are then also involved in other spaces. And so kind of been drawn out to those other spaces by just knowing then the people who are involved there.
Brilliant, thank you. I can see you've got your hand up, Chris.
Yes, it wasn't a question so much as a just thank you. It's just a lovely little presentation, lots of interesting things going on. And I mean, what strikes me is the social side of it, and the way that you kind of packaged it. It's a tour, so that in itself is, you know, people can come and they can take that tour, or they can, whether they do it online or it's just a lovely story that's more than one place, and it's bigger, so it's bigger than the some of its parts, if you see what I mean, when you add on the, you know, the effect it can have for other people that are looking for that sort of example or experience or demonstration, so that they can join in do their own stuff, join into that one as well. So thank you, I really enjoyed that.
You're welcome. Thank you. I think I was a little concerned. I didn't want it to just be, you know, a show and tell, have some kind of takeaway. No, but knowing that I'm, you know, much newer to the space than you all are, I'm glad to hear that it was still interesting to see so many different types of community growing spaces.
Yeah, and I mean, you're using, you know, principles, you're using it to illustrate principles of design and permaculture and that sort of thing. So it's a really living teaching example as well as a story. Yeah, I love that.
Thanks, Chris.
Alison?
Yeah, mine was not so much a question, just as a comment. But yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed that. I'm kind of really interested in urban spaces, even though I live in the middle of the countryside, really. But yeah, I thought it was interesting how you talked about those spaces being more about bringing people together. It wasn't about making the space perfect. And when we were talking about our you know, what our sort of set of principles was going to be for the forest garden we were talking about setting up, we realized it wasn't really so much about growing food, but about the garden being a focus in the community for learning, I suppose. Really, we realized it could be somewhere that we could hold workshops, or we could explain what permaculture is, or explain what a forest garden is, and in a way the food was, you know, it was a part of it, but it became clear it wasn't the most important thing. So
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that was what I found interesting.
That story garden is also more of a teaching garden. Their purpose really, I think, is to, like, I'm part of a program there where on Saturdays we'll go and have basically a course that's on a different topic every odd Saturday that they run it, and it's targeted at gardeners who are involved in other community sites, so that it can be a place where we come together and learn some skills that we then bring back to our communities and our gardens, and kind of exponentially kind of expand the learning from there. So it would be nice to get to a point where we're outside of Story Garden also starting to run some of those learning and community sessions. It seems to be what people are really interested in who get involved in the gardens that I've been a part of.
Where you mentioned that they were going on to another space, do you know where that is?
I don't is the short answer, but can find out if that's of interest.
Yeah, I was just curious.
It's somewhere else in London, but I can't remember exactly what.
Yeah.
Where.
Yeah. Thank you.
Rebecca, I can see you've put a couple of interesting comments in the chat. Would you like to share them with us?
Hi there. Yes, I'm not sure I've got very much more to say than I put in the chat. But we've got a really nice project which is in a former bowling green in the corner of a park. And it's quite near to a big hospital site in South Cambridge. And we're very suburban, and there's lots of green verges, sort of post-war council housing. So actually, a lot of people in the area have almost got too much garden rather than not enough. We have a real mix of ages in our volunteers, from almost babies up to people in their late 80s. But the last year has been really tough because of trying to keep these, you know, what's actually quite a big site going through lockdown. You know, times when we've had to lock the garden before, when people were really nervous about it. We lock it and unlock it every day, but apart from that, it's open for park users to come in. So sort of security and vandalism are quite key for us. We have to make sure that everything we do is really robust and actually can't, you know, we can't leave too much stuff out just in case somebody kind of injures themselves on it. So I think it's fascinating that these urban spaces are so very different. They have to respond to the location, but also to the people who are going to develop them. And I think we've been doing it for about 5 years. And at first I thought that it was going to be a sort of edible bowling green and full of produce. And actually, I'm really pleased that I didn't do that, and that we developed it really slowly, because it means that even 5 years on, we're still deciding what to do with different parts of the site. And it means that different people can get ownership, you know, because we have quite high turnover of volunteers. So the people we had 5 years ago are very different from the people that we have now, but they all have really strong ownership in it, because they've been involved in making those decisions and deciding what to plant and looking after it and everything else. So I don't know, it's difficult in a garden in London where you've only got 2 years, but if you've got a larger space that's a permanent space, my advice for people would always be to develop it really slowly, and for it not to look finished, because then you can continue to involve people, knowing that in 5 years' time I might not be involved in it and somebody else will want to change it. So, but it's a nice space, and anyone's very welcome to come. It's not really very permaculture, but I'd like it to be more so.
Thank you, Charlotte. Gary, you've just popped a comment in the chat.
Always a mistake, isn't it?
You've been rumbled.
Yeah, I think one of the things that it's too early to say, obviously, but I think there's going to be an impact on what were existing maybe community projects where people, so for example in Poole, our community garden had people that would travel some, not miles, but some distance to attend some of the community garden, the one that I'm involved in. And they've now had about 18 months of not going there, and I think it's been left. A few people went in occasionally, I believe, but it's been left largely to fend for itself over the last 18 months. And I think it's going to be a while before people kind of feel they want to invest that much time and energy again until they know until they know it's safe to. Does that make sense? That the idea that we did all this and now suddenly we're told we've got to stay in our homes and we can't go there. Whereas of course the allotment sites, we could all visit our allotment sites as long as we followed social distancing and sort of cleanliness guidance. But the community gardens couldn't be attended in the same way. And I wonder, well, it's too early to say, isn't it, how that's going to pan out. But I really like the comment about not finishing things, because as a natural idler, I always see you should never really finish a job. You should always leave something unfinished, otherwise somebody just finds something else for you to do. Yeah.
That sounds like really good advice, Gary. I think maybe I'm going to take that on as my new mantra. I'm curious to know what other people's experiences have been with COVID and being able to have volunteers on their projects, and where you're all at now with regards to the world opening up a little bit more. Are volunteers coming back? Are you feeling okay with having volunteers on your site? Are you keeping things small? What are people's thoughts?
I'm happy to talk again if that's all right. We kept volunteering right through. I do the project with my husband, so we were a household group, so at least there were 2 of us, and then we added 1 person, and then we added 2 people, and then we had up to 6. So we just had to reflect what the government rules were all the time. We decided that it was our daily exercise, so we did it for an hour, and now we're not doing drop-in yet, although a lot of projects are, but we sort of pre-book. So we have small groups up to about 6 or 8 people, but that's in the context of, what can be lots of other families in the space. We don't allow people to go inside our structures, so it's just me and my husband that go into them, and we put all the tools out, and we're just more careful. So as far as and we're not very good about wiping tools down and that kind of thing, because as far as I'm concerned, the risk for the virus is aerosol rather than tool sharing. So it's worked well, and the wonderful thing is, as soon as we could open it up, which was last June, it's been absolutely packed full of people, and they've absolutely loved it. We put a polytunnel up in September, and we haven't grown anything apart from people, and they used it like a community centre when they couldn't go anywhere else. So we've had birthday parties and all kinds of stuff. It's been really good. Oh, it's my front door.
Thanks, Rebecca. I mean, I started a project. I started a small medicinal herb garden at the community allotments that I'm involved with during lockdown, which felt a bit counterintuitive. But actually, I live on my own, and I kind of needed to have some situations in my life where I could interface with other human beings. So, because ours is a site for members only, we kind of have a locked gate policy, but I set up a little Facebook group, and we organised work days about once a month, and everybody just came along. We designed things very slowly together. I got people researching herbs online beforehand, so we built a bit of a database of medicinal plants so that we could work out where were the best places to put them. And then we built it very slowly together, but it was usually between 4 and 6 people turning up to a pre-arranged work day. And actually it was really nice. And I sort of had to fight my desire for everything to happen and look brilliant immediately, because it is a slow process, and I think the garden will evolve over the next few years. So we actually managed to do it, but on a very small scale. Does anybody else have any experiences of managing to keep things going during the lockdown, or are you starting to invite people back onto your sites now?
We've never stopped having volunteer sessions at our incredible edible ones. We limited the numbers. We sort of did it in shifts, 2-hour shifts through the day, but we've been able to carry on within the government guidelines all the way through, and we've seen a massive increase in interest. And our main project has got loads of people there now, so it's been positive in that respect. People are starting to see the benefits of being in nature.
How have you managed to organise that, Mike, if you've been doing shifts of volunteers?
We have a WhatsApp group, and people just put the name forward. You know, we say what's happening on a Saturday, and people put the name forward for whichever 2-hour session they want. I mean, now we're opened up again, but this is what we did during the lockdowns, and it worked okay.
Thanks, Mike. Is there anything else? I can see lots of things are popping up in the chat. I've discovered that actually, because I'm recording this, when I pull the chat up, all I can see is the chat screen so I can't currently read what's in the chat. So if anybody's popping anything in the chat that they'd like to say to the group, then just jump in. But I'll save all of the comments.
Okay. I've put a comment in asking about thriving communities. I don't know if anybody else has heard of the thriving communities work. It's from what I understand, and Mike kind of just touched on this. The idea of, you know, the being out in nature and the benefits of that, and of course coming from Dorset, we've got an awful lot of countryside around us. There is, I believe, small pots of money. I'm not sure where you apply to get it, to kind of get some things like community gardens and stuff going it's part of the whole social prescribing agenda, and you know, GPs and clinicians and actual social prescribers being able to signpost those people, what we would usually call either the worried well, that are, you know, often going to see their GP for social. The end of the scale is people with chronic illnesses that could be better managed by them if they had access to things like green spaces, therapy spaces, art in nature, and that sort of thing. I mean, that's you know, not in my permaculture life, but in my paid job, that's something I'm involved with in Dorset. I just say to everybody, just maybe do a Google on thriving communities and see what that chucks out locally, because there could be an opportunity here for some of the projects you're all working in to be closer linked to statutory services, and it won't bring you any money, but it may get your name out there more in the public view, and people, you know, knowing. I mean, I expect a lot of you have experienced. We certainly did with our community garden. The number of people that lived just around the corner didn't know we were there. And the one thing we didn't really have the time to do was advertise that we were there, because we were so busy doing the kind of the manual labour on the site. So that could be an opportunity for projects, land projects especially, maybe.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Gary. I'm certainly going to do my homework on that. I'm curious to know whether you have to be kind of an official and constituted group to be able to access that funding, or whether just sort of being a small voluntary garden is enough?
So the reason, I've got to get my ducks in a row here. We are a host organisation because we have a turnover of X number of pounds, you know, as a charity and a social enterprise. The smaller groups that actually saw the funding came together as a collaborative and then asked us to join them because we could literally hold the purse strings. What I guess our Thriving Communities project, and we got something called Nature Buddies as well, which is about, you know, one of the biggest issues people have when they, you know, when they're signposted by a social prescriber is that initial stepping over the threshold experience of we don't know anybody, we don't know what it's going to be like. So there was some money, I think, to support people, what we call Nature Buddies, to help people, you know, to ease them into that. No, generally for smaller projects, they probably wouldn't be able to access any actual funds, but by being involved, they would get the free promotional stuff. And, you know, who knows where that can lead to, would be my view on that. And also getting, you know, because lots of us probably are unaware of other projects and people doing similar work to ourselves that are just around the corner. And I'm a great believer in, you know, that random selection thing of throw them in a room, maybe provide some coffee and see what they come up with on their own without somebody else saying you should be doing this. Well, it's design, isn't it? It's basically letting the clients discuss what they can offer and what their needs are, and then just needing a bit of maybe infrastructure support to get that going.
Thanks, Gary. That's really helpful.
We were accepted for social prescribing last year, and we didn't get many referrals last year because of obvious reasons, but we're starting to get them through now. And that's been really positive for us.
And so is it GPs mainly that are referring people?
Yeah, anybody dealing with mental health issues.
Okay. Does anybody else have any more questions? Either questions for Molly or a bit of an update as to where you're at with COVID and your project? If not, then I think it'd be really nice just to all do a bit of an update as to where we're at. Be nice to hear about everybody's news, even if it's been a slow news month. Okay, I'm going to take that pause to mean that there's no more questions. I'm going to stop the recording.